Jangestig was born on August 19 in Stockholm, where she spent most of her childhood and youth. She grew up in a simple family and was the younger of two daughters. Her older sister's name was Kotina. At the age of 19, she married a young man named Nicholas, whom she had already met at school. He was not much older than Emma, and at the time of the wedding, she was already expecting a child. At 20, Emma became a mother for the first time, giving birth to a son whom she named Max. A year and a half later, she had a daughter named Saga. But despite the birth of two children together, the couple was too young and not ready for family life and domestic challenges. They constantly argued over trivial matters, could not find common ground, and soon decided to separate after their daughter's birth. The question of child custody was resolved harshly and painfully. Nicholas wanted not only to financially support the children, but also to actively participate in their lives and upbringing. Emma had no objection, but soon she was in a new romantic relationship. Emma moved with her new lover to a small town called Orrua, located about 150 km from Stockholm, and took the children with her. Her ex-husband was against it because he wanted to see his son and daughter every day. The ex-spouses met in court more than once, trying to resolve the issue, and Nicholas even threatened Emma, whereupon she immediately notified the police. However, the problems could not be resolved peacefully, and each parent began to seek sole custody. Emma met a man named Torgny Hellberg online. They quickly understood each other, grew closer, and had an affair. The young man was not bothered that the 23-year-old already had two children from a previous marriage, as he had long dreamed of a family and was willing to accept them as his own children. Initially, the couple lived in a small house that Torgny had inherited, but when they decided to get married, they moved to a larger apartment where they could live comfortably and each child could have their own cozy room. At this time, Torgny had a good job with a decent salary, and Emma was busy raising small children and creating a cozy home. As a trained designer, she planned to work in her field again in the future. The couple intended to marry in the summer of 2008, but these plans were not to be fulfilled. March 17, 2008 was a perfectly normal Monday. Torgny went to work early in the morning and Emma stayed home with 3-year-old Max and 1.5-year-old Saga. In the evening, she cooked dinner because her fiancé was on his way back. In the meantime, Emma chatted online with her sister Kotina, discussing a gift for their parents' upcoming wedding anniversary. Around 7:30 p.m., Emma received a call from Torgny, who told her he would be late from work and would come home a bit later so she could start dinner without him. After the brief conversation, Emma continued with her household chores. She fed the children and then sat back down at the computer to continue her correspondence with her sister. At 7:07 p.m., their communication was suddenly interrupted mid-word. Kotina found this strange because she saw her sister typing a message but not sending it. 5 minutes later, she called Emma, but she didn't answer. Then Kotina called Torgny to find out what had happened. The young man was on his way home and approaching the house. He assured Kotina that everything was fine, Emma was probably distracted by the children and would call back as soon as possible. But when Torgny arrived at the door, he was surprised. The front door was unlocked. Once inside, he noticed the mess. At first, Torgny thought it was the children playing and scattering their belongings, but then he saw the brownish red stains on the floor. When he realized with horror that it was blood, Torgny began to call out Emma's name and the children's names loudly, but no one responded. In the corridor, Torgny noticed a strange object on the floor. At first, he thought it was a doll because the figure lay in a completely unnatural pose. But as he got closer, he realized it was Saga, lying in a pool of her own blood. Her head and face were mutilated beyond recognition and transformed into a bloody mess. A little further away, her brother lay in a similarly gruesome condition with a shattered skull. Their mother also lay on the floor, covered in blood and in an unnatural pose, severely broken and disfigured. None of them seemed to show any signs of life. The shocked Torgny, with trembling hands, pulled out his phone and dialed the emergency number to report what had happened. At that moment, Emma suddenly shuddered and let out a long groan. Police and paramedics immediately arrived at the scene, found a faint pulse in all 3 victims, and quickly began resuscitation. The scene was horrifying. No one could imagine who could have inflicted such an atrocity on a young woman and her children. But first, all efforts were directed towards getting the victims to the nearest hospital and trying to save their lives. The paramedics who arrived there doubted from the start that the victims would even make it to the hospital. However, all 3 were still alive when they were brought to the hospital. All were diagnosed with open head injuries with severe brain damage and significant blood loss. The doctors gave no prognosis but did everything they could. Max and Saga were in critical condition. Even if they could be saved, the chances of them breathing on their own were minimal. The mother's condition was classified as very serious but stable. The young woman was put into an artificial coma and connected to life support machines, hoping her body would cope. While the doctors fought for the victims' lives, forensic scientists worked at the crime scene, trying to find evidence and reconstruct a picture of what had happened. The house was chaotic, with scattered objects and blood on the floor and walls. Unfortunately, the paramedics had left a mess because they moved objects to get to the victims. The floor where Emma, Max, and Saga lay was trampled, and now investigators had to figure out which prints were left by the paramedics and which belonged to the perpetrator. It is noteworthy that the assailant committed the massacre in a maximum of 13 minutes. Emma's last message was sent at 7:07 p.m., and by 7:20 p.m., Torgny had already called the police and reported the incident. The brutality with which the perpetrator massacred the victims suggests a personal hatred for them. The murder weapon was most likely a heavy blunt object, presumably a hammer, with which the perpetrator struck his victims. However, nothing of the sort was found at the crime scene, leading to the conclusion that the perpetrator took it with him. Torgny Hellberg was the first suspect. He was not married to Emma and was not the father of her children. Investigators suspected that an argument between the two could have escalated into a massacre. The gruff man was immediately interrogated, but he had a solid alibi. Firstly, he was indeed late for work, which was confirmed by his boss and colleagues. Secondly, at the time of the brutal massacre of his loved ones, he was on the street and was captured by several surveillance cameras. Nevertheless, Torgny was asked to give a detailed statement. Perhaps he had seen or heard something important that would help the investigation. However, he could remember little. Everything was as usual until he saw the chaos and the blood-soaked bodies on the floor. The first thing that alarmed him was the unlocked front door, which could mean that Emma herself had let the perpetrator in. After the interrogation, the man was released. By this time, he had already informed Emma's family about the incident, and her parents, along with her older sister Kotina, drove by car from Stockholm directly to the hospital to visit the victims. But on the way there, they heard the terrible news on the radio. Max and Saga had died from their injuries without regaining consciousness. The next suspect was Emma's ex-husband and father of the children, Nicholas. The two had been divorced for over a year, and the separation had not been easy. The ex-spouses often argued and fought over child custody, and Nicholas even threatened Emma, which she reported to the police. Everything seemed to clear up after the separation. The young woman took the children and moved to another city with her new lover. After the father failed to obtain custody through legal means, he decided out of hatred for Emma to take a desperate step and in a fit of rage kill them all. Nicholas was quickly found and taken into custody, but the man was devastated by the news of Max's and Saga's deaths, crying and constantly asking if it was an accident. When he was suspected in this case, he was initially shocked and then screamed that he would never harm his children, whom he loved dearly. When asked about his whereabouts at the time of the crime, Nicholas said he was on a business trip in another city. That sounded strange, but soon his alibi was confirmed. At the time of the massacre, he was indeed 200 km from the crime scene. Forensic experts continued to work at the crime scene, trying to find clues, traces, or evidence that could point to the perpetrator. However, the perpetrator had obviously worn gloves and left no fingerprints. As for shoe prints, the situation was more complicated. After all, dozens of paramedics were in the house, providing aid and removing the victims. Now, all prints had to be collected to find out which ones did not belong to the paramedics, Torgny, or the victims. The police feared that after learning Emma had survived, the perpetrator might sneak into the hospital and finish the act. After all, she was an important witness. If she regained consciousness and could testify, she would surely betray him. For this reason, Emma's room was guarded around the clock. Meanwhile, the police searched the neighborhood for possible witnesses. A woman recalled seeing a suspicious stranger in black clothing near Emma's and Torgny's house around 5 p.m. It seemed strange to her, but she couldn't recognize the man's face because it was covered by a hood. However, the neighbor suspected it might have been a woman, as the figure was small and fragile. The same figure in black clothing and with a hood over her head was recorded by a surveillance camera installed outside a store near the crime scene. The police also assumed the footage showed a delicate woman, but who was she and why would she want to harm Emma and her children? They decided to show the tape to Torgny to see if he had any idea who the stranger was. Already during the first few seconds of the footage, the man's face turned pale, and he said it could be his ex-girlfriend, 31-year-old Christine Schurrer, although he wasn't 100% sure. Torgny's ex-girlfriend, Christine Schurrer, was born in 1977 in Hanover, Germany. When she was still a child, her father left the family and practically stopped communicating with his daughter. This negatively affected her mental state and behavior. Christine grew up stubborn and determined, but with a rather complex character. As a teenager, she went to the USA as part of an exchange program and lived in New York for several years. She received a good education in history and archaeology and traveled extensively through Europe to participate in excavations and expeditions. In the summer of 2006, she traveled to the island of Crete in Greece, where she got a job as a tour guide in a hotel. There in July, 26-year-old Torgny came for a vacation, whom Christine immediately noticed. She also liked the intelligent, interesting, and educated man, and they began an affair within the first few days of their acquaintance. Schurrer was 29 years old at the time, but the small age difference did not bother her. Their relationship lasted for a week while Torgny was on vacation at the hotel. After he left, they continued to call each other and correspond via the internet. A few months later, Christine came to Hellberg in Sweden and literally begged to stay with him. Even then, Torgny found her behavior too pushy and even tactless. When Christine offered him a weekend trip to the mountains, he refused, earnestly hoping that this would be the last time they saw each other. But she kept calling him, writing to him, and insisting on another meeting. In January 2007, Torgny directly told Christine in a phone call that it was over between them and that they should no longer meet. But Christine continued to call as if she hadn't heard him. She asked to visit him and invited him to go on vacation together. In the spring of 2007, she came to Sweden again and began to literally stalk her ex. She tried to persuade him to resume the relationship, although he honestly admitted that he was already with another woman. Then Christine said that she had forgotten some things at his house during her last trip and that she now needed to pick them up. Torgny agreed, but as soon as they entered the house, the ex-lover tried to seduce him. After he decisively rejected her, she said he would regret it. 3 months later, Christine returned again, apologized for her behavior, and tried again to persuade him to meet. but Torgny rejected her again. That evening, she called and said she had taken pills because she didn't want to live without him. Helberg called an ambulance for her, contacted her family, and advised her to see a psychiatrist. After Christine received the necessary treatment at the hospital, her mother picked her up and sent her to a psychiatric clinic where she stayed for over a month. However, the treatment did not bring the desired success, and she remained obsessed with her ex, constantly thinking about how she could win him back and inventing new reasons for meeting. In October 2007, Christine decided to move to Sweden and settled in a suburb of Stockholm, where she rented an apartment with another woman. She began to stalk her ex again. One day when she met him, she told him that she had had a son by him, but had given the child to a foster family. Torgny was shocked by this news, but what interested him most was when it had happened. The last time they had slept together was over a year ago, and during that time they had only met 3 times, and Christine had shown no signs of pregnancy. When he started asking questions, she answered evasively, adding new details each time. In January 2008, after dozens of unsuccessful attempts to meet with him, Christine announced that her son had been diagnosed with some kind of hereditary disease and that they now had to travel to Germany to visit him. She also added that the boy's adoptive father would contact him and tell him all the details. At this time, Torgny and Emma were in the process of moving into their new house, and Emma knew the whole story. She believed that Torgny's ex-girlfriend was only trying to lure him to Germany and that no son existed. When Torgny received a call from a man who introduced himself as the adoptive father of his and Christine's child, he began, at Emma's suggestion, to ask questions. When the boy was born, in which hospital, and so on. The man was visibly annoyed, tried not to answer, and finally just hung up. Torgny was ultimately convinced that there was no son and that Christine had made it all up by asking someone she knew to play along. After hearing such a convoluted story, investigators quickly found out where the new suspect lived and drove to that address. The door was opened by Christine's neighbor, who informed them that Christine had packed her bags in a hurry the day before and returned to Germany. A check revealed that Christine had indeed left the country, so the Swedish police had to enlist the help of their German colleagues to arrest her. On March 20, an arrest warrant was issued against her. Upon her arrest, Christine claimed it was a mistake and that she had nothing to do with the murder. When she was brought to Sweden on March 29, she asked for a meeting with Torgny, which was denied. Christine behaved completely calmly but kept asking if she could meet her ex or at least call him. Christine's rented apartment was thoroughly searched. Her phone and laptop were confiscated and all her belongings, including her clothes, were thoroughly examined. No traces of blood were found. By this point, investigators had already determined which of the bloody prints at the crime scene did not belong to paramedics or family members. Based on the print, it could be determined that they were sports shoes. We were able to determine the brand and appearance of the shoes. The shoe size matched the size worn by the suspect. However, Christine claimed she had never worn such a shoe model. This claim was quickly refuted by her neighbor, who identified the shoes. An even more interesting discovery awaited investigators in Christine's laptop. It was full of photos of Torgny, both together and those where the man was alone or with his new girlfriend. In a separate folder with an unpleasant name, there were also photos of Emma and her children that Christine had copied from her rival's social media pages. Each of the photos was signed by Schurrer with insulting, threatening, and frankly terrifying comments. The seized search history contained queries such as how to commit a murder without leaving traces, how to cover up a crime, how to divert suspicion from oneself. The notes also contained a plan of Emma's and Torgny's apartment, records of when the man went to work and when he returned, as well as other details about the family's daily routine. Emma's condition stabilized and gradually began to improve. At the end of March, doctors decided to gradually awaken her from the artificial coma. When she woke up, she still couldn't speak because of the breathing tube, but her gaze indicated that she was aware. It was clear that she recognized her relatives in the ward. However, she still didn't understand what was wrong with her and why she was in the hospital. After Emma's condition improved and she could speak again, the police decided to talk to her. However, they decided not to tell her what had happened to her children. Emma could not remember the events of that fateful day and was sure she had been in a car accident. She kept asking about the children and how they were. Initially, she received evasive answers, but then the family and the team decided there was no point in hiding the truth. When Emma learned what had happened and that her children were no longer alive, she became hysterical. The doctors had to give her sedatives, after which she fell asleep. When she woke up, she remembered nothing again and asked about her children again. This went on for several weeks, and during this time she was told several times that her son and daughter had died, but her brain apparently refused to accept this information and deleted it from her memory each time. After another month, Emma decided to return to the crime scene, accompanied by paramedics. As she entered the house, she suddenly remembered everything. The young woman said she had been writing a message to her sister and setting the table while the children played nearby. There was a knock at the door and she went to open it. A dark, small female figure stood on the threshold. When Emma asked what she wanted, she felt a piercing pain. Everything went dark and the figure stepped through the door. Emma, with her last strength, tried to catch up to her to protect the children, but apparently fell into the corridor, where she was attacked again, and they tried to kill her. Christine continued to stubbornly deny her guilt. The murder weapon was never found, and most of the collected evidence was circumstantial, giving her a good chance of going unpunished. However, Christine's flatmate reported during her interrogation that a hammer had disappeared from her toolbox in March. She showed the investigators the toolbox, and they determined that the size and shape of the tool matched the murder weapon. But even that was only circumstantial evidence. Investigators managed to find video footage from a bus stop in the suburb where Christine had appeared 3 times in the week before the crime. She could not explain why she traveled to Abuja so often, but she apparently came to keep an eye on her future victims. The suspect also could not explain why she searched the internet for information on covering up crimes and why she collected photos of Emma and her children. On July 29, 2008, the trial against Christine began. She was accused of double murder with particular cruelty as well as attempted murder. During the trial, she behaved more than strangely. When she entered the courtroom, she smiled and waved as if greeting everyone present. When she was asked questions about the massacre and shown horrifying images of the crime scene with the mutilated bodies, she suddenly began to laugh. This led some to believe she was mentally disturbed. However, the ordered psychiatric evaluation found that Christine was sane and fully aware of what had happened. Consequently, she enjoyed her actions and did not even try to hide them. When Emma was present in the courtroom and saw Christine, she fainted. When she regained consciousness, she said she now remembered everything and that Christine's face was the last thing she had seen on that fateful day. Despite her lawyers' attempts to prove their client's innocence, the jury unanimously found her guilty on all counts. Christine was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. She was also ordered to pay euros 20,000 in compensation to Emma. No evidence was found that Christine was ever pregnant or gave birth to a son by Torgny. Emma's recovery process was long and difficult, but Torgny did not abandon his beloved. In the summer of 2010, they married. The couple is now raising 2 children together who know the sad story of their older brother and sister. After Christine was sentenced to life imprisonment, Torgny and Emma's lives gradually began to improve. However, this terrible story left deep marks on their fate. Although Emma tried to forget the tragedy and build a new life, she constantly felt the presence of something ominous, as if Christine's shadow would not let her go even after her incarceration. If you liked the video, please give it a like. That helps a lot with its spread. Also, leave a comment to support the channel and recommend the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Well, thanks for watching and take care.